Who was George Washington? Chapter 8, Victory. The Continental Army was in shambles in the spring of 1781, yet only 7 months later the war ended. One battle changed everything. For a long time, Washington had dreamed of retaking New York City, which had been captured by the British. Washington wanted a big win badly, but wisely he now focused on victory in the South, in Virginia. The British commanding general, Lord Charles Cornwallis, had just moved his entire army to Yorktown, Virginia. It was on a peninsula, which meant his army was surrounded on 3 sides by water. As American ships headed into the area, a fleet of French ships joined them. Then Washington sent 2,000 troops to join forces with French soldiers at the tip of the peninsula. All told, Washington had the strength of 21,000 men. Cornwallis had only about 7,000. Cornwallis's army was not only outnumbered, it was hemmed in on all sides. The British were trapped. The battle began, and on October 17th, on the 8th day of bombardment, General Cornwallis surrendered. 2 days later, George Washington sat on his favorite horse, Nelson, watching the defeated British soldiers march out of Yorktown. He did not realize right then that this victory spelled the end of the war, but it had. The Americans had won independence. It took 2 years before a treaty between Britain and the United States was signed in Paris, France. As soon as word of the treaty came, Washington said farewell to his army. First, he said goodbye to the ordinary soldiers. He called them a patriotic band of brothers. A month later, he met with his officers in Francois Tavern in New York City. The tavern is still there. He broke down in tears. Here were men who had stood with him through the long years of war. Each officer stood before him for a handshake, then a kiss on the cheek. George Washington resigned from the army. On Christmas Eve, 1783, he arrived home. Martha was there at Mount Vernon to greet him. He planned to take up farming again and spend the rest of his days in Virginia. He was 51 years old. It was time to retire. The Treaty of Paris. The war ended in October 1781. The Treaty of Paris wasn't signed until September 1783. The treaty recognized that the United States was a separate free country. The boundaries of the new country would go from the Great Lakes and Maine to Florida, from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River. A famous artist at the time named Benjamin West was to paint a group portrait of the British and the Americans who signed the treaty. The painting, however, was never finished. Although the Americans, including Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, posed for West, the British refused to be in the picture.